The letter came on a Tuesday, carried the last wet mile by a boy on a pony. It was addressed in a hand so old and so firm that Selina Radham knew, before she broke the seal, that it came from a woman who had never once in her life been refused a thing she truly wanted. She read it standing at the window of her 2 rented rooms, where the light was best. Candles were dear, and she had learned to arrange her days around the free hours of daylight. The letter was from the Dowager Duchess of Elmsford, whom she had never met. It was brief. It was blunt. It did not waste a word on the flattery that great ladies usually spend on women they mean to employ. It said that the Dowager had heard from a mutual acquaintance that Mrs. Radham was a woman of learning, discretion, and uncommon good sense, widowed, self-supporting, beholden to no one. It said that the great house at South Tarn, in the Northern Fells, had been shut up and let go for the better part of 10 years. Its library was rotting. Its rooms stood under Holland covers. Its accounts were in a state the Dowager described only as disgraceful. And it said in the last line, the line Selina read 3 times over, that the house had been allowed to fall to ruin because the man who owned it had fallen to ruin first. The Dowager was too old and too far away to mend either. She required someone who could. There was a postscript in the same firm hand. It said, "My son does not know I am writing to you. He will not thank me. Come anyway." Selina Radham was 31 years old. She had learned, in the 7 years since her husband's ship went down off a coast she had never seen, that a woman with no fortune and no protector has exactly 2 things to sell: her labour and her judgment. The second was worth a great deal more than the first, if only she could find someone with the sense to pay for it. She had been a naval captain's wife. That is to say, she had run a household and a small property alone for years at a time while he was at sea. Then alone for good, when the sea kept him. She kept accounts better than most men of business. She read 3 languages. She had nursed the dying and buried the dead, haggled with tradesmen, and stood up to a bishop. She had done all of it without once being seen to weep in public, because she had understood early that a woman who weeps in public is a woman other people feel entitled to manage. She did not need the Dowager's money, quite. She had a small income, carefully husbanded, that kept her in 2 clean rooms and plain food, and let her refuse work that insulted her. But she was bored. It was the particular grinding boredom of a capable person given nothing to do. And she was curious. The last line of the letter had caught on something in her that she did not examine too closely. A man who had fallen to ruin. A house let go for 10 years. A mother too proud to say the word help until the postscript, and then only sideways. She wrote back that afternoon, accepting, and named her terms plainly, and did not soften them. A woman who softens her terms is a woman who has already begun to lose. The Dowager's reply, when it came, agreed to everyone, and added a line that made Selina, alone in her rooms, almost smile. It said, "I knew you would do. The ones who name their terms are the only ones worth having." So it was that on a raw afternoon, at the very end of winter, with the light already failing at 4 o'clock, Selina Radham came at last to South Tarn, and saw the house that mirrored the man. The fells rose grey and enormous on every side, still streaked with old snow in their high hollows. The road ran up a long, dark valley beside a river the color of iron. And at the head of the valley, where the ground flattened before it climbed again, lay a tarn, a small, deep mountain lake, black and utterly still under the failing light, holding the grey sky in it like a sheet of slate. The house stood above the tarn. It had been a great house once, and it was a great house still in its bones, but it wore its neglect the way a proud man wears his poverty. Everywhere and nowhere, in the blind, shuttered windows, in the moss on the north walls, in the weeds standing dead in the carriage sweep. Half the chimneys were cold. The gardens had gone back to the moor. It was the house of a man who had stopped 10 years before and had not started again, and it sat above its black, still tarn like a thing holding its breath. Selina looked at it a long moment from the carriage window. She did not feel the dismay the dowager had perhaps expected of her. She felt, instead, the quiet stirring of a capable person who has been shown a great deal of work worth doing. The house was not dead. She could see that even from the road. It was only waiting. Houses, like people, can wait a very long time. She was received by the housekeeper, a gaunt, anxious woman named Mrs. Peel, who had plainly not expected to keep house for anyone ever again. The hall was under covers. The great stair went up into the dark. A dust sheet had slipped from a mirror, and Selina caught her own reflection in it, grey with travel, and thought that she and the house were well matched, the pair of them worn and waiting. "His Grace keeps to the old wing," Mrs. Peel murmured, as though the words themselves might be overheard and punished. "He does not dine with company. He does not receive. He will not have known you were coming, ma'am. The dowager will not have told him." She twisted her apron. "You'll forgive me saying it, but the last 3 the dowager sent, they none of them lasted the week. The cold and the quiet, and His Grace. It is not an unkind house, ma'am. It is only a house that has forgot how to have people in it." "Then it will remember," said Selina, drawing off her wet gloves. "Houses do. Now. I have travelled since dawn, and I should like a fire, and something hot, and to see the worst of what I have come to before I sleep, so that I do not lie awake imagining it worse than it is. Which room is the library?" Mrs. Peel looked at her as though she had asked the way to the moon. Then, slowly, something in the frightened face eased, the way a servant's face eases when it meets, after long absence, someone who plainly means to take charge. "This way, ma'am," she said. "Mind the 3rd stair. It has been meaning to give for a year, and no one has had the heart to mend it." "We shall mend it Thursday," said Selina, and followed her into the dark. That first evening she saw the worst of it, as she had asked to, and the worst was very bad. Mrs. Peel took her through room after shrouded room by candlelight, and everywhere it was the same story. Damp and cold, and covers grey with a decade of dust. Good furniture warping, fine plaster falling. A great house dying by inches for want of anyone to care whether it lived. Selina did not exclaim. She took a small book from her pocket and made notes in it, room by room, in her neat hand, the way she had once made notes of a ship's stores. A house, like a ship, is saved by an inventory before it is saved by anything else. You cannot mend what you have not first counted. They came at last to a long, dark corridor in the old wing, and Mrs. Peel stopped and would go no further. "His Grace is beyond there," she whispered. "We do not go beyond there without he rings." Selina looked down the dark corridor. She understood that somewhere at the end of it, a man was sitting alone in the cold, as he had sat alone in the cold for 10 years, and that the whole vast dying house had arranged itself around that one still point of grief, the way a body arranges itself around a wound. She did not go down the corridor, but she stood a moment looking at it, and she thought, not with pity, but with the plain, practical resolve she brought to everything, that a house cannot be saved while its heart is stopped. She had been hired to save the house. The 2 tasks were therefore one task, whatever the dowager had chosen to call it. She slept that night in a cold, clean room Mrs. Peel had aired for her, under more blankets than she was used to. She did not lie awake imagining the work worse than it was, because she had seen it plainly and knew exactly how bad it was, and knowing a thing plainly is the surest cure for fearing it. She woke before dawn, as she always did, and dressed in the dark, and went out to see the house by the first grey light, alone. That was how she came to the library, and to the man in the chair. She met the master of the house the next morning, and she met him by accident, which was the only way anyone met him at all. She had risen early, as was her habit, and gone exploring the house alone by the cold light of dawn, taking the measure of the work. She opened a door she took for another shrouded parlour, and found instead the library. The library. The one the dowager had said was rotting. She stood on the threshold in real distress. It was a magnificent room, and it was dying. Damp had got into the north wall. Books stood swollen and spotted on the shelves, whole runs of them past saving. The great globe in the corner had cracked along its meridian. The smell of the room was the smell of slow ruin, mould and cold ash and neglect. Selina Radham loved books the way some women love children, helplessly and without calculation. The sight of a great library left to rot moved her more than the ruined house had done. She went in without thinking, crossed to the worst of the shelves, and drew out a spoiled volume with a small sound of grief. "Leave it," said a voice from the shadows by the cold hearth. "There is no one to read them." She turned. A man was sitting in the dark of the far corner. He was in a deep chair, set with its back to the grey window, so that he showed as a shape against the light, and no more. She understood at once that he had been there before she came, in the cold and the dark, and that he sat there often, and that the chair was placed as it was on purpose, so that anyone entering would see his outline, and not his face. She had been warned. The dowager had not described him, but Mrs. Peel had murmured a word or two, frightened, and Selina had understood. The scar, the war, the 10 years. "Your Grace," she said, and curtsied, because whatever else he was a duke, and she had manners. "I am Mrs. Radham. Your mother engaged me to see to the house and the books. I did not mean to disturb you. But I am glad to have found you, because I have a great many questions, and it is far easier to ask them of a man than of a frightened housekeeper." There was a silence. She had the sense that he was not used to being addressed as though he were an ordinary man with ordinary business, and that the experience was not entirely welcome to him. "My mother," he said at last, in a low, hard voice, "had no right to engage anyone. This house is not to be meddled with. You may consider your engagement at an end. Mrs. Peel will see you are paid for your trouble and your journey. There is an inn at the foot of the valley. The carriage can take you down before the light goes." "It cannot," said Selina. "The carriage went back this morning. I saw it go. And I have signed an agreement with the Dowager Duchess, witnessed and sealed, which I do not break. A woman who breaks her agreements is not worth engaging. So I am afraid you are stuck with me, Your Grace, at least until the terms are met or bought out. And I should tell you plainly that I am expensive to buy out. I named my terms high, on the theory that any man reduced to hiring a stranger to save his library had better be able to afford her. It was not meant to be amusing. She was only telling him the truth, as she told everyone the truth, because she had found long ago that the truth saved a great deal of time. But something happened in the shadowed shape by the window, a stillness, and then a sound she could not at first place, so brief and so rusty was it. A short, rough exhalation, almost a cough. She understood only afterward that it had been the ghost of a laugh, the memory of one. A laugh that had got halfway out of a man who had forgotten he owned one, and been strangled before it could finish. He rose. He came a step out of the shadow, into the grey light, and let her see him. She understood that he did it deliberately, as a kind of test, or a kind of cruelty to himself, to watch her flinch. She did not flinch. He was tall and raven dark, and would have been a handsome man once, in the hard aristocratic way. Down the left side of his face, from the cheekbone to the line of the jaw, ran the long silvered seam of an old sabre cut, a cavalry wound, 10 years healed. It pulled the corner of his mouth very slightly out of true, and had taken the ease from that whole side of his face, so that it no longer moved as a face should. His eyes were a clear, cold slate blue. They were fixed on her with a still and terrible attention, waiting for the thing that always came. The widening, the quick glance away, the softening into pity, or the hardening into distaste. Selina looked at the scar, because it would have been an insult not to. Then she looked at the man, and she said, in the same plain voice, "That was a cavalry sabre, I think. My husband was a naval man, but I have nursed enough soldiers to know the marks. It was well stitched, considering. You were fortunate in your surgeon. Most men in that war were not." He said nothing. So she went on, because she would not begin their acquaintance by pretending not to see what stood in front of her. "It is a hard thing to carry on the face," she said, "where everyone must see it, and no one may mention it. I imagine that is the worst of it. Not the wound, the not being allowed to speak of it, so that it sits in every room like a fourth person no one will name." He stared at her. For a long moment he did not speak at all. She thought perhaps she had gone too far, as she sometimes did, for she had never learned the trick of leaving true things unsaid. And then the Duke of Elmsford said, very low, in a voice gone strange, "No one has said that to me in 10 years. "Then everyone you know is a coward," said Selina, "or too kind, which comes to the same thing in the end." She turned back to the shelf. "Now, the north wall of this library is letting in water. Half these books are past saving, but only half. The other half can be saved if we begin today. I shall need braziers and clean cloths and every strong pair of hands in the house for a week. May I have them? Or shall we let the rest rot to spite your mother?" He gave her the hands and the braziers and the cloths. He told himself it was only because it was easier than arguing, and because she would be gone within the month in any case, driven out by the cold and the silence, as everyone was driven out. He did not examine why he had come out of the shadow and let her see his face. He did not examine why her failure to flinch had left him feeling, for the rest of that grey day, as though something long frozen had shifted a fraction. The way ice shifts on a tarn in the first thaw, with a sound like a distant shot. Dominic, Duke of Elmsford, had not always been the man in the dark chair. He remembered, though he tried not to, the man he had been before Spain. A young officer of cavalry with more spirit than sense, who laughed easily and often, who rode and danced and courted, and believed, in the shallow, untried way of the young, that the world was a thing arranged for his pleasure. That man had gone to the war in the peninsula because it was the fashion and the duty of his kind, and he had discovered there what such men discover, that the world is arranged for no one's pleasure, that courage is not what one imagines, that the men one commands will die on one's orders, in numbers, in the mud, and go on dying in one's sleep for the rest of one's life. He had taken the sabre cut in a cavalry action on a hot Spanish afternoon. He remembered almost nothing of the blow itself, only the strange lack of pain and the blood in his eye, and the fact that the man beside him, a boy of 19 named Timms, whom he had promised the boy's mother to look after, had taken the same stroke a moment later and had not risen. He had come home with half his face and none of his laughter, and a company of ghosts. He had come to South Tarn, the remotest of his houses, and he had shut the door. He had not meant it to be 10 years. No man means a thing to be 10 years. It happens a day at a time, each day a little easier to stay shut than to open, until the staying shut is not a choice anymore, but a habit, worn so deep, it feels like the shape of the world. The scar had been his reason at first, or his excuse. He had gone into society once, early, and seen the faces, the flinch, the pity, the pretty woman who had gone white and turned away. He had understood that the world he had been born to would receive him now only as a curiosity or a horror, and he had decided he would not be received at all. But the scar was not truly the reason, and in his more honest hours, which came at night, he knew it. The reason was the ghosts. The reason was Timms and the others, and the plain fact that he had lived, and they had not. A man who has watched better men than himself die in the mud has no business laughing, ever again, at anything. So he had stopped. And the house had stopped with him, as houses do. The tarn below the windows had gone on, holding the grey sky in its black water, year after year, still and cold and closed. That had been his life. He had expected it to be his life until it ended, which he did not much care how soon. And now there was a woman in his library who had looked at the ruin of his face and talked to him about surgeons. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. She was there the next morning and the morning after, and she did not go away. She worked. That was the thing that undid him in the end, though it took a long while, and he fought it the whole way. She did not sit with him and draw him out. His mother had tried that in the early years, sending up a succession of gentle companions hired to be soft at him until he fled the room, and he had fled everyone. Selina Radham did nothing of the kind. She simply worked all day at the saving of his library, with her sleeves turned back and a smudge of mould on her jaw. And she left him alone unless she wanted something. What she wanted was usually hands. Within the first week, she had the whole household at her command. She had got it not by rank, for she had none, but by knowing what she was about. Selina understood damp. She had kept a naval captain's house on a wet coast for years, and she knew that you do not simply dry a book. You dry the air around it, slowly, or the covers crack, and the pages cockle worse than before. So she set the frightened servants to work in a system, and the system was so plainly sensible that they stopped being frightened. She had the braziers set at a distance, and moved by the hour, never close enough to scorch. She had the worst books stood open, like little tents, down the middle of the long table, spine up, to let the air walk through them. She trained 2 housemaids in an afternoon to lift a spoiled binding without tearing it. She set a footman to turning the cracked globe a quarter each day, so that it dried true and did not warp further along its seam. She named a task for each pair of hands, and thanked each pair when the task was done. By the end of the week, the servants of South Tarn, who had crept about a dead house for 10 years, doing as little as they dared, were following her from shelf to shelf like ducklings. They argued among themselves over who should have the saving of the good calf bindings. They were proud of the work, because she had shown them the work was worth being proud of. The Duke watched it from his chair. He told himself he came to the library each day to guard his property. He knew that he lied. He came to watch a competent woman do difficult work well, because he had not seen anyone do anything well, or care about doing it well, in 10 years. And the sight of it was like water to a man who had not known he was thirsty. She had a way of speaking to him that no one else had. She did not defer. She did not coddle. And she did not, above all, pity. He had grown so used to pity that he could no longer tell it from kindness, and had rejected both together for 10 years as the same soft, insulting thing. Selina gave him neither. He was short with her in those early weeks. Often. It was the only weapon he had left, and he used it clumsily, the way a man uses a tool he is ashamed of. One grey morning, she asked him where the estate papers were kept, because the accounts were in a disgrace, and she meant to mend them. He answered without turning his head, in the flat, cold voice he kept for the world. The accounts were not her concern, he said, and she would do well to remember what she had been hired for. I was hired by your mother, said Selina, unhurried, to put this house in order. And a house is its accounts before it is anything else. But I see you are in a temper this morning, so I shall ask you again tomorrow, when you are not. And you will tell me then, because you are a reasonable man under all of that, and reasonable men do not let their houses rot to spite their mothers past the first week. And she went back to her books. She did not look to see how he took it. She left him sitting in his chair with nothing to push against, because she had simply declined to be pushed. She asked him again the next morning. He told her where the papers were. It became, without either of them naming it, the way of things between them. She waited out his tempers the way one waits out weather, without fear and without offence, and then went on exactly where she had left off. And he found, to his confusion, and then to something he would not yet let himself call relief, that a man cannot long enjoy being cruel to a person who declines to be wounded by it. The cruelty had been a wall. She simply walked through it every day, as though it were not there, until he began to wonder why he had built it. It was the accounts that first drew him out of his chair for a reason other than to watch her. She had asked for the estate papers, and he had given them, and she had taken them to the long library table and gone through them the way she went through everything, patiently, thoroughly, and with a growing indignation she did not trouble to hide. For she found, as she had half expected, that a house left to itself for 10 years is not merely a house neglected. It is a house robbed. The Duke's agent, a comfortable man in the market town, had drawn his salary for a decade and earned none of it. He had let the whole estate slide, and had let it slide in the particular way that lines an idle agent's pockets. Good timber sold, and the money not fully accounted. Rents collected late or not at all, the arrears written off rather than pursued, because pursuing them was work. 2 farms standing empty that could have been let. A drainage rate paid for years on land the old Duke had drained long before, that needed it no longer. It was not grand thievery. It was the small, steady seepage of an estate with no eye on it. Over 10 years it came to a sum that made Selina set down her pen and sit still. She did not go to the agent. She went to the Duke. "You are being robbed," she said plainly, laying the papers before his chair. Not greatly, and not by a villain. Only by a comfortable man who understood long ago that no one was watching. "I have marked it all here. It is a great deal of money over 10 years. And more to the point, it is a great deal of your own land gone slack, and your own tenants gone sour, because a tenant who is never visited and never helped soon stops caring for ground he thinks no one else cares for either." He looked at the papers a long moment. She went on. "I can put the papers right in a month, but I cannot put the land right. Only you can do that. It is yours, and it wants its master, not its master's hired widow with a ledger." "You could have simply mended the accounts," he said. "It is what my mother hired you for. You need not have shown me any of this." "I could," Selina agreed. "And you would have gone on sitting in that chair while a stranger set your house to rights around you. It would have been one more thing done to you, rather than by you, and you have had 10 years of things done to you. I did not think another would help. Ride out with me tomorrow. See your own land. It has missed you. Land does." And the next morning, for the first time in 10 years, the Duke of Elmsford rode out over his own estate, with a plain widow beside him on a borrowed cob. He looked at the empty farms and the slack rents and the sour tenants, and he began slowly, stiffly, like a man using a limb long unused, to be a duke again. It did not come back to him all at once. At the first farm they stopped at, the tenant, an old man named Sowerby, who had farmed there under the Duke's father, came out wiping his hands, and did not know his own landlord. And then knew him, and did not know what to say. For the Duke had been a rumour in his own valley for 10 years, a scarred ghost up at the great house that no one saw. There was an awkward silence. And then Selina, plainly, asked Sowerby about his barn roof, which she had marked in the accounts as unrepaired these 6 years. The old man's face changed. Here at last was someone from the great house who knew the state of his roof and seemed to think it mattered. He began to talk. The Duke listened, and before they rode on he had promised the man his slates, and meant it. Sowerby stood in his yard and watched them go with an expression Selina had seen on the faces of the house servants her first week, the cautious, disbelieving beginning of hope. It went so, farm by farm, through that long morning. The valley began, slowly, to understand that its master had come back to it. And the valley, which had been sour, began, slowly, to sweeten. In the evenings at first, he did not come. He took a tray in the old wing and sat alone, as he had for 10 years. But the library was warm now, with its braziers and its new fires, and it was the only warm room in the house, and a cold man is drawn to warmth whatever his intentions. So he began to come. He would sit in his chair, by the hearth, with a book he did not read, on the far side of the room, and she would work on at the long table, and neither of them would speak for an hour together, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was the silence of two people, each glad, and, neither willing to say so, of not being alone. One such evening she was cataloguing by candlelight, murmuring the titles half aloud as she wrote them, and she came upon a book he had not thought of in years, a book of his boyhood, and she read the title out into the quiet room. He said, before he could stop himself, that it had been his father's, and that he had hated it as a boy and loved it as a man, which was the way of most things his father gave him. It was the first thing he had told her of himself that was not forced out of him. She only nodded and wrote it down, and did not make anything of it, and went on to the next. But he noticed that she set that book aside, apart from the others, on the corner of the table nearest his chair, where he might reach it. She said nothing about that either. He turned it over in his hands for a long while after she had gone up, and did not read it, and could not have said why the sight of it, set aside for him without a word, had loosened something in his chest. The first time she made him laugh, she was not trying to. That was the whole of why it worked. It was some weeks in. The library was half saved. She was up a ladder, reaching for a high shelf, when Mrs. Peel came to the door in a state of anxious flutter to announce that the vicar had called. The vicar called once a quarter, out of grim duty, and sat in dreadful silence for the correct 20 minutes, and left. It was a visit both men loathed, and neither would end. The Duke, from his chair, said in the flat, weary voice he used for the whole business of his own life, that Mrs. Peel might tell the vicar he was not at home. "He knows you are at home," said Selina, from the top of the ladder, not turning round. "You are always at home. You have been at home for 10 years. It is the least convincing lie in the north of England. The poor man has to pretend to believe it 4 times a year, which is surely penance enough for whatever he did to deserve this parish." She reached for the next book. "Let him in. Give him a decent glass of something, and ask him about his roof. A vicar's roof is always failing, and he will talk about it for 20 minutes, and you need say nothing at all. It is far less trouble than the lie, and it has the advantage of being kind, which the lie is not." There was a silence, and then it came out of him before he could stop it, before he even knew it was coming. A real laugh, short and rough and rusty as an unused hinge, dragged up from somewhere he had bricked over 10 years before. It astonished him more than it astonished her. He put his hand to his mouth, to the scarred side, as though to catch it or hide it. The laugh pulled the old wound tight and made the smile beneath it crooked and strange, half a face laughing and half a face that had forgotten how. Or he sat there with his hand over his mouth and his slate eyes wide above it, appalled and amazed. a man who has heard a sound in an empty house and realized it was his own voice. Selina came down the ladder. She looked at him, and she did not make anything of it, which was the kindest thing she could have done. She understood, without being told, that a thing had happened that must not be remarked upon, or it would never happen again. "The vicar," she said. "The roof. Go on. I shall be here mending your books, and I promise to look very busy, so that he thinks you have serious estate business and cannot be spared for long." And the Duke of Elmsford, still shaken, rose and went and received his vicar and asked him about his roof. The poor, astonished clergyman talked about it for 25 minutes. It was the least dreadful visit the two of them had shared in a decade. Afterward, the Duke stood a long time at his study window, looking down at the black, still tarn, and put his fingers again to the scarred corner of his mouth, where the ghost of the laugh still seemed to sit. He did not know whether he wanted to weep or to do it again. That was the beginning of the thaw, and like all true thaws, it did not run smooth. Ice that has stood 10 years does not go out of a tarn in a day. It groans and cracks and refreezes in the cold nights and heaves. There were days after that first laugh when the Duke was worse than he had ever been, colder, harder, more determined to drive her out, precisely because she had reached him, and it frightened him past bearing. This was the wound itself, fighting for its life, though neither of them would have called it that. The wound had kept him safe for 10 years, safe in the way a locked room is safe, and it did not mean to be unlocked, and it used every weapon it had. Its weapons were all turned inward. The morning after the vicar, he did not come to the library at all. He sent word by Mrs. Peel that Mrs. Radham was to confine herself to the books, and not to trouble the rest of the house, which she had lately begun to set in order, room by room. It was a small, cold cruelty, and Selina understood it exactly for what it was. He had laughed, and now he was ashamed of it, and he was punishing them both. She sent word back by the same trembling housekeeper that she quite understood, and would confine herself to the books. She added that the room next the library, the small parlour, was letting in nearly as much water as the library had, and would spoil its panelling within the month if it were left. But that she would of course not trouble it, since she had been forbidden the rest of the house. Then she went on with her work. By afternoon, he had come to the door of the library himself. He stood in it, stiff and grim, and said that she might see to the small parlour after all. She thanked him gravely, as though the matter were settled between reasonable people, and did not smile, though she wished to, because she had won a skirmish he did not yet know they were fighting, which was the skirmish for his own life, and she meant to win it without ever letting him feel beaten. The house began to come back with him. That was the strange grace of it, and Selina, who had not planned it, watched it happen with a quiet wonder. As the Duke thawed, South Tarn thawed. He gave the orders now, or she suggested, and he gave them. The covers came off the rooms one by one. Fires were lit in hearths that had been cold for a decade. The moss was scraped from the north walls, and the weeds pulled from the sweep. Men came up from the village to mend what 10 years had broken. The great dead house began, room by room, to breathe. It was as though the master and the house were one creature, which in a sense they had always been, and could not revive apart. Selina found she could measure his recovery by the house. She could tell what kind of night he had had by whether he ordered the east shutters opened. She could read the state of his heart in the state of his rooms. And she did not tell him she read him so, because a man newly learning to live again must be allowed to think himself unobserved. There was a night that first spring when the state of things showed itself plainly. A ewe was down in the home pasture, lambing badly, and the shepherd was old, and his hands were stiff, and the farmer's boy came up to the house, half in tears, because the ewe would die and the lambs with her. In the old days, no one would have dreamed of troubling the Duke. But Selina was in the hall when the boy came, and she did not hesitate, and she called for lanterns, and went out into the wet dark herself, because she had lambed ewes before, on the wet coast, and a life is a life. She did not ask the Duke to come, but he came. She heard him behind her on the path, and did not remark on it, and the two of them knelt in the straw of the cold byre by lantern light for the better part of an hour, and between them they turned the lamb, and brought it living into the world, and its twin after it. The Duke's hands were good at it, better than hers, steady and unhurried, and she saw that a man who has learned to do a hard, bloody thing under fire does not forget the steadiness of it. When the lambs were up and butting for the teat, he sat back on his heels in the straw with blood to his elbows and looked at them, the two small, living things he had helped into the world, and something moved in his scarred face that she had not seen there before. Not laughter, something older and quieter, the look of a man who has spent 10 years dealing only in death, and has just with his own hands done the opposite. "You are good at that," she said plainly, wiping her hands. "You should do it oftener. There is a great deal of living work on an estate this size, and you have let others do all of it for 10 years, and I think it has not been good for you, doing no living work." He looked at her across the lantern light. "You say things," he said slowly, "that no one else would dare." "I know," said Selina. "It is my chief fault," my husband used to say, though he also said it was my chief virtue on the days it suited him. She rose and shook the straw from her skirts. "Come, you are covered in blood, and so am I, and Mrs. Peel will have hot water, and in the morning there will be 2 lambs alive that would have been dead, and that is a good night's work, whatever else is true." And the Duke of Elmsford, who had not done a good night's work in 10 years, rose and followed her up to the house through the wet dark, and did not feel that night quite so much like a ghost. After the night of the lambs, something in him let go a little further. He came to the library every evening now, and he did not pretend to read. He sat by the fire near her, and sometimes they talked, and sometimes they did not, and the not talking had become as easy between them as the talking. One evening she was reading, and the wind was loud on the fells, and a shutter had come loose somewhere above, and was banging. She saw him flinch at it, a small, hard flinch, quickly mastered. The flinch of a man for whom a sudden noise will always, to the end of his life, be a gun. She did not remark on it. She only rose without a word, and went and found the loose shutter, and made it fast, and came back, and took up her book again, and said nothing. He said nothing either. But he watched her the whole way across the room and back, and something in his face had gone soft and unguarded. She had understood the flinch without being told, and mended the cause of it without making him name it, and no one in 10 years had done him that particular small mercy. He did not thank her. He knew she did not want to be thanked. But that night, when she rose to go up, he stood as she passed his chair, which he had not done before. It was a small thing, a courtesy any gentleman shows a lady. Between them, it was not a small thing, and they both knew it, and neither of them said so. The surest sign of his coming back was the children. There was a tenant's child, a small grave girl of perhaps 6, named Nan, the daughter of the man who kept the home farm. She had none of the fear of the great, scarred, silent duke that her elders had, because she was too young to have been taught it. She had wandered up to the house one warm afternoon after a stray lamb, and had come upon the duke in the reviving garden. She did not flee. She planted herself in front of him, and looked up at the long scar with frank childish interest, and asked him, without the smallest cruelty, whether it had hurt. The Duke had not spoken to a child in 10 years. He found himself crouching down to her level. "It hurt very much at the time," he said gravely. "But it does not hurt any longer. It only looks as though it does." Nan considered this with great seriousness. Then she informed him that she had a scar, too, on her knee from a gate, and showed it to him with enormous pride, tugging up her stocking to display a small white mark no bigger than a barley corn. The Duke examined it with equal gravity, and pronounced it a very fine scar, quite as good as his, which pleased her enormously. Then, having settled the matter of scars, she recruited him, with the ruthless efficiency of the very young, to help her catch her lamb. Selina watched the whole of it from the library window, unseen. She watched the Duke of Elmsford chase a lamb around his own reviving garden at the direction of a 6-year-old. She watched him corner it at last against the wall, and catch it, and hand it to the child. And she watched him, when the lamb was safe, lift Nan up to see over the wall at something she wanted to see. His scarred face was quite unself-conscious for once, turned up to the small, serious girl, and there was on it a warmth that 10 years of society had never once been permitted to see. Selina had to sit down. The sight of it had done something to her chest that she had not felt in 7 years, and had thought she would never feel again. That was the day she understood that she was in danger. And being a woman of sense, she named the danger to herself plainly, alone that night, and did not pretend it was anything other than what it was. She was coming to love him, not to pity him, which was a thing she had never done, not to mother him, which he did not need, and she would not have offered. To love him, the difficult, thawing, half-scarred, slowly reviving man of him, the dry, rusty laugh she had surprised out of him, the grave gentleness he showed a farm child, the ghosts he carried, and the courage it took him, more courage than the battle that scarred him, to open a single shutter. And loving him was a danger, because Selina Radham had built her hard-won independence out of the wreck of her widowhood, plank by plank. She had come to value it above comfort, above company, above almost anything. To love a man, to bind herself again, above all, to bind herself to a duke, to a title and a great house, and the whole heavy apparatus of a world that would scrutinize and judge her, was to risk the one thing she had sworn after her husband's death she would never risk again: the sovereignty of her own life, She had been a wife once. She had been, even in a good marriage, a thing that belonged to someone. She had promised herself she would never be that again. And here she was, in a reviving house in the northern fells, in danger of promising the opposite. She did not run from it. That was not her way. But she did not act on it either, not yet. The choice, if it was to be made, was one she meant to make with her eyes open, in her own time, on her own terms, not to fall into like a girl. The world, which had forgotten the Duke of Elmsford for 10 years, remembered him again that summer, the way the world does, at the worst possible moment. A cousin of his came north. He was a smooth, pleasant, fashionable man, named Mr. Aldous Sarn, who stood next in line to the dukedom, should the Duke die without a son, and who had spent 10 years quietly hoping the recluse at South Tarn would oblige him by doing so. He had heard, through the servant's grapevine, that runs faster than any post, that a woman had come to the house, and that the Duke had been seen to speak, and even to laugh, and Mr. Sarn did not care for the sound of it at all. A duke who laughs is a duke who may marry. A duke who marries may get an heir. So Mr. Sarn came north, all cousinly concern, to see how things stood. He was pleasant to Selina, in the way that is worse than rudeness. He complimented her competence as one compliments a good upper servant. He wondered aloud, smiling, how fortunate his poor cousin was to have found a woman willing to bury herself in such a place, for such a purpose, at her age. And over dinner, which the Duke endured for the first time in years, for the sake of not seeming driven from his own table, Mr. Sarn turned the talk, gently and cruelly, to the past. To the ball there had been at South Tarn, the last summer before Spain. To how gay the Duke had been then, how handsome, how sought after. Before. He let the word before sit in the air. He looked once with pleasant sorrow at the scar, and he said how glad he was to see his cousin so much recovered, though of course, he added, a man in the Duke's position, with the succession to think of, must consider his duty carefully, and could not be expected to form any connection that was not, in every particular, suitable. The Duke had gone very still and very cold. Selina saw the old shadow come down over him, the shadow she had spent months lifting, and she saw the wound rise up in him at the word suitable, telling him again all the things it had told him for 10 years, that he was a ruin, that any woman near him must be after his rank, or moved by his pity, that he had no business wanting. Selina set down her glass. "Mr. Sarn," she said pleasantly, "you have said a great deal about your cousin's duty, and his position, and what is suitable, and you have looked twice at his face while you said it, thinking I did not notice. So let me be plain, as I generally am, because I find it saves time. You did not come north out of concern for your cousin. You came because you heard he might live, and marry, and get an heir, and you have spent 10 years preferring that he do none of those things, because if he does none of them, the whole of this passes to you. That is not a wicked thing to hope. It is only a human thing. But it is a poor reason to sit at a man's table and remind him, sweetly, of everything the war took from him. I have nursed better men than you, and buried them, and I know the difference between concern and appetite. You may finish your dinner, but you will not do that again while I am at this table, because I will not sit still for it. And I am, as you have observed, past the age of caring what a man like you thinks of me." There was a ringing silence, Mr. Sarn's pleasant face had gone quite white, and the Duke of Elmsford, at the head of his own table, looked at Selina Radham as though he had never truly seen her before. No one had ever defended him. In 10 years, no one had ever once stood between him and the world's soft cruelty, and simply refused to let it pass. He had defended himself when he could, with silence and distance. He had never had a champion. And here was one, in a made-over gown, telling his heir to his face to mind his manners, and past the age of caring, who knew it. Mr. Sarn left in the morning. And that night, for the first time, the Duke did not merely endure Selina's company. He sought it. He found her in the library, and he did not sit in his far chair as he always did. He drew a chair to the fire, near hers, and he sat, and for a while he said nothing. Then he told her the thing he had told no one. He told her about Spain, not the version he gave the world, the clean version, the cavalry action, the wound. He told her the true version, in the low, halting voice of a man saying words he has kept behind his teeth for 10 years. He told her about the boy Timms, 19 years old, whose mother he had promised to see him safe. He told her how the boy had ridden at his left hand that afternoon, frightened, and how he had told him it would be all right, because that is what one tells frightened boys, and how the same sabre stroke that opened his own face had killed the boy a moment later, so that he had lived, and the boy had died on the strength of a hand's breadth of chance, and nothing else. He told her about the letter he had written to the boy's mother, and how he had not been able to make it true, and how he had never gone to see her in 10 years, because he could not stand in front of her having lived when her son had not. He told her that he had stopped laughing because it seemed a theft, that every hour of ease he took felt stolen from men who would never take another, that he had thought, coming north, that if he shut himself away and took no pleasure and let the house rot around him, it would be a kind of loyalty, a keeping faith with the dead. Selina listened to the whole of it, plainly, without flinching, as she listened to everything. She did not fill his silences. She did not offer comfort he had not asked for. She let him lay the whole of it before her, the wound behind the wound, and she did not turn away from any of it. And when he had finished, and sat spent and shaking a little in the firelight, having emptied out 10 years into the quiet room, she did not tell him it was not his fault, which he would not have believed, or that time would heal it, which was a lie. She said, "You did not steal your life from Timms. A sabre stroke that misses by a hand's breadth is not a theft. It is only the world being what it is, cruel and blind and caring nothing for our deserving. You have spent 10 years punishing yourself for the crime of surviving, as though your misery could be paid across to the dead like a debt. It cannot. Timms is not warmer for your cold, nor safer for your grief, nor less dead for your never laughing. The dead ask nothing of us, Dominic. It is the living who need us. And there is a woman in the south of England who lost her boy, and to whom you have never gone, because you could not bear it. I will tell you plainly. Your not going has spared her nothing, and cost her the one man alive who could tell her that her son was brave and was loved, and did not die alone. You owe her that. You do not owe the dead your ruin. You owe the living your courage. It is harder. That is why you have chosen the ruin. It is easier to sit in the dark than to go and stand in front of a grieving mother and be looked at. But you are not a coward, whatever you have told yourself these 10 years. And I think you know the difference. And I think it is time you did the harder thing. It was the first time she had used his name. Dominic. She had not planned to. It had come out of her with the truth, as her truths did, without leave. And he heard it land in the quiet room, and he did not correct her, and neither of them remarked on it, but something in the using of it had changed the air between them, and they both knew it. He went south within the month. It was the hardest thing he had done since the war. Harder than the war, and he told her so before he went, standing in the hall with his gloves in his hand, and his face grey. She did not tell him it would be easy. She told him it would be hard, and that he would do it anyway because he was not a coward, and that she would see to the house while he was gone. And he went. He stood in front of the boy's mother, a small, worn woman in a small, clean cottage, and was looked at, and did not flinch from the looking. He told her that her son had ridden at his left hand, and had been brave, and had been loved by the men, and had not died alone or afraid, and that the fault of his dying was no one's but the war's. He gave her the boy's watch, which he had carried 10 years and never been able to send. He stayed 3 days. He mended her roof with his own hands, because it wanted mending, and he found he could not sit still in the same room as her grief, without doing some small useful thing with it. And when he came away, she held his scarred face between her 2 old hands, and thanked him, and forgave him the thing he had never been able to forgive himself, which was that he had lived. And it was the beginning of his being able, at last, to forgive it too. He came back to South Tarn, changed, lighter, as a man is lighter who has set down a thing he has carried 10 years. He came, Selina understood, not only back to the house, but back toward her, though neither of them yet said so. But a wound that has ruled a man for 10 years does not give up its ground without a last stand. The closer he came to her, the harder, for a time, it fought. There was a fortnight, late in that summer, when he drew back from her again. It was the old pattern, and she knew it by now, but it was worse this time, because there was more to lose. He had let her see the whole of him, in the firelight, the night of Tim's, and a man who has shown another the whole of himself is never so frightened as in the days after. So the wound rose in him and told him its oldest lie, the one it had told him for 10 years, and told him now with a new and specific cruelty. It told him that a whole woman, sound and capable and free, could not truly want a half-ruined man, that if she stayed, it must be from duty, or from the softness of a kind heart, or from the habit of tending broken things, that the only honourable thing was to send her away before she woke one morning, and understood what she had bound herself to. He grew formal with her. He spoke of the work as nearly finished. He said, one grey afternoon, in the flat voice she had not heard in weeks, that she must not feel obliged to remain at South Tarn past the summer, that he would see her handsomely settled, that a woman of her parts should not bury herself in the fells on his account. Selina put down her pen. She looked at him a long moment, and there was no hurt in her face, only the level understanding that was worse than hurt, because it saw straight through him. "You are frightened again," she said. It was not a question, and it was not an accusation. It was a diagnosis, delivered in the plain, unbothered voice of a woman who has nursed a great many frightened men and lost her fear of their tempers long ago. You let me see the whole of you, and it terrified you. And now you have decided the safest thing is to send me off before I can leave you first. I understand it. I will not do it. She rose. She was not a tall woman, and he was a tall man, and she looked up at him without the smallest fear. I am not staying out of duty. I have no duty to you. Your mother hired me for a library, and the library is nearly saved, and I am free to go tomorrow. I am not staying from softness either. I am not a soft woman, as you have had ample cause to learn. If I stay, and I have not yet said that I will, it will be because I have looked at you with my eyes open and chosen to. You cannot frighten me out of a choice I have not yet made. So you may as well stop trying, and let us both wait, like grown people, to see what I decide. He stared at her, and the wound, which had ruled him 10 years, felt the ground go soft beneath it. There is no weapon in all its armory that works against a person who declines calmly to be managed by fear. He did not send her away. He could not. He had met, at last, a strength greater than his grief, and it was not trying to defeat him. It was only waiting for him to be brave enough to be happy. The estate revived through that summer as he revived. The last of the covers came off. The gardens were cut back and began, tentatively, to remember what they had been. And through it all, there was one room Selina had not been permitted to touch. One door in the south front that stayed shut, its shutters closed. And she did not force it, because she had learned that some doors a man must open himself or not at all. He opened it in high summer, on a long gold evening, and he took her with him. He took her, without a word of explanation, along the south front to the shut door. He stood before it, and for a moment he could not open it, and she waited, because she had learned to wait. And at last he opened it, and they went in together into the dark. And he crossed to the windows, and with hands that were not quite steady, opened the shutters one by one. The summer evening light came flooding into the long room, and Selina saw. It was a ballroom, or it had been. A long, beautiful gallery with a floor made for dancing, a musician's gallery at the far end, and tall windows looking down the valley to the tarn. It was the one room in the house that neglect had not touched, because it had been shut and sealed and left exactly as it was. It stood now like a room inside a held breath, the last room of his old life preserved. Chairs were still set against the walls, as if for a gathering. In the great cold hearth lay the grey ashes of a fire 10 years dead. "The last time I laughed," the Duke said, standing in the flooding light with the long unused room before him. "Before you, before the vicar, was in this room. There was a ball here, the summer before I went to Spain. The last of the old life. I danced in this room, and I laughed, and I was a fool, and I was happy, and I did not know it, which is the way of it." He turned to her. The summer light was on the ruined side of his face, on the long silver scar, and his slate eyes were wet and unashamed of it. "When I came back, I could not enter it. I shut it up. I could not bear to see the place where that man had been happy, knowing what became of him. I have not crossed this threshold in 10 years. He looked at the room, and then at her. "I do not know why I have crossed it now," he said. "That is not true. I know exactly why. Because of you. I have done every difficult thing of these last months because of you. I am telling you this badly, for I am 10 years out of practice at telling anyone anything, but I would rather tell you badly than not at all. You came into my dead house, and you did not flinch. You did not pity me. You saved my books. You made me laugh. You gave me back the name of a boy I could not say aloud for 10 years. And you sent me south to his mother, and you defended me at my own table to a man who wished me dead. Somewhere in the doing of it, you have made me want to live, which I had given up wanting. I do not know how to say what that is, except to say that I love you, and that I have no right to, and that I am telling you anyway, in this room, where the last happy man I ever was danced the summer before the world ended. It was the longest speech of his life, and it cost him more than the sabre had. And Selina Radham stood in the flooding light of the reopened ballroom, and understood that the choice she had promised to make with her eyes open had come to her, and that she was ready. She did not fall into his arms. That was not her way, and he would not, she knew, have wanted a thing so easily got. She stood where she was, and looked at the whole of him, the scar and the man, and the 10 years, and the wet slate eyes. And she made her choice aloud, herself, first, plainly, because she was a woman who named her terms. I want you to understand what I am about to do, she said, and her voice was steady, because I do not do it lightly, and I will not have you think I do. I am a widow. I have been my own woman for 7 years, beholden to no one, mistress of my own small life. I have valued that more than I can easily tell you, because I earned it out of grief, plank by plank, and I swore I would never give it up. To choose you is to give up a great deal of it. It is to become a duchess, which I do not want. It is to be looked at and judged and managed by a world I have spent 7 years keeping at arm's length. I have counted the cost of it carefully, because I count the cost of everything. It is how I have survived, and I have decided that I will pay it. She stepped toward him, across the dancing floor. I choose you, Dominic, not because you need me, though you do. Not because I pity you, which I have never done, but because I have looked at you as clearly as I have ever looked at anything, and I see a man worth the whole cost and more. I would rather be less free beside you than wholly free without you. There. I have said it first, and plainly, and I meant every word. Now you may stop looking so astonished and answer me, because I have just given up my sovereignty for you, and the least you can do is not stand there gaping like the vicar. And the Duke of Elmsford laughed. It came out of him full and unforced and whole, the second true laugh of his new life. And this time he did not put his hand over his mouth to catch it or hide it. He let it come, crooked scar and all, half a face laughing freely, and half a face doing its best. It filled the long, reopened ballroom where the last laugh of his old life had died. It was not a theft from the dead, and he knew it now. He knew it at last. He crossed the floor to her, the dancing floor of his ruined youth, and took her plain, capable hands in his, and said her name, which he had not once said aloud. Selina. And it was a vow. And she gave him his, Dominic, first spoken across a ruined library, and now spoken here as a promise. The summer light came down the valley off the Black Tarn and filled the room. There was no ghost in it any more. Only the two of them, and the dust, and the light. They were married before the summer ended, quietly, in the small grey church at the foot of the valley. The Dowager Duchess sat in the front pew, looking as though she had arranged the whole of it, which in a sense she had. Selina wore not the widow's greys she had worn for 7 years, but a gown the colour of the summer fells, chosen by herself, on her own terms. It was the last free act of the free woman she had been, and the first glad act of the woman she chose to become. She shed the greys for good that day, and did not miss them. The wound did not leave him. That was never the way of it, and Selina had never expected or wished it. The scar remained, silver down his cheek, pulling his smile always a little out of true. There were nights still when he woke with the mud and the screaming and the boy Tim's in his eyes. On those nights she did not try to cure him, because some things are not curable, only bearable, and bearable is enough. She only lay beside him in the dark, and let him not be alone in it, which was the one thing that helped, and the only thing she had ever offered. And in the morning the fells would be there, and the house alive around them, and the work of the living day to do. There was a great deal of the living day to do, and they did it together. He was a duke again in earnest now, out over his land in all weathers, and she ran the house and the books, and between them Southtarn came fully back to life. Its farms were let, its tenants visited, its rents made fair, its rooms warm. The child Nan became a fixture about the place, forever underfoot, and the Duke, who had spoken to no child in 10 years, could refuse her nothing. He taught her to ride. He let her call him by a name no duke had ever been called, and did not mind. And once, in the 2nd year, the boy's mother came north to visit them, the small, worn woman from the southern cottage, and stayed a fortnight. She sat by the fire with Selina while the Duke was out, and the 2 women spoke of their dead, the sailor and the soldier, plainly and without weeping, as women do who have carried grief a long way, and made a kind of peace with the carrying. The dead were not gone from that house. They were only, at last, allowed to rest in it, spoken of and honoured and not hidden, which is all the dead ask, and all the living can give them. The ballroom was used again. Not often, and never grandly, for they were neither of them grand people, and the fells are far from anywhere. But once or twice a year the long gallery was opened and lit, and the county came up the dark valley in its carriages, and there was music in the musicians' gallery, and dancing on the floor where the last happy man he had been once danced. The Duke could not dance well any more, for the leg had been hurt too, along with the face. He stood at the edge, with his scarred face and his slate eyes, and watched his wife move through the figures. He did not mind that he could not join her. She came back to him between every dance, every time, on purpose, so that the room should know whose she was, and whose he was, and that they had both chosen it. And he laughed now. That was the thing the county remarked on, the thing that went round the fells and down to the towns as the strangest news in years. The scarred recluse Duke of Elmsford, who had not been heard to laugh in 10 years, laughed now, often. A rough, crooked, half-broken laugh that was somehow the warmest sound in any room he was in. He laughed most of all at the plain, unvarnished things his Duchess said, the true things she had never learned to leave unsaid. And he laughed at them, not because she was trying to amuse him, for she never tried, but precisely because she was not. Because she went on, all her life, telling him the truth as plainly as she had told it to him, across a rotting library, on a grey morning at the end of winter. And the truth, spoken plainly by the one person who had never once been frightened of him, was the funniest and the dearest and the most healing thing he knew. On the last still evening of that first married summer, they walked down together to the tarn. The small, deep black lake had held the grey sky in it, unmoving, for all the 10 closed years. It was not black now. The low sun was on it, and it held the gold of the sky and the green of the fells, and the two of them at its edge. A light wind moved on the water, so that the held breath of it was let go at last, the whole surface stirring and alive. Selina looked at the tarn, and looked at the reviving house above it, and looked at the man beside her, the scar and the slate eyes and the crooked healing smile. She did not say anything, because some things are best said in silence. And he understood her silence, having learned at last to read her, as she had always read him. The house had waited a long time. Houses can. And so, it turns out, can men, if someone comes at last, who is not afraid to open the shutters, who saves what can be saved, who tells them the truth, who laughs with them and not at them, and who chooses them